Привет, друзья, buongiorno a tutti. Mi riconnetto oggi in emergenza in quanto non era previsto questo video. È successo un fatto grave ai confini della Russia, in particolar modo nella zona dell'aeroporto militare di Millerovo, entro quindi i confini russi. È stata intercettata una pattuglia di esploratori, li hanno chiamati sabotatori, ma probabilmente saranno stati esploratori ucraini. Dopo l'intercettazione è nato un conflitto a fuoco con le forze dell'esercito russo e le guardie di frontiera, quindi con questi sabotatori che hanno richiesto aiuto. La zona del conflitto è a pochissima distanza dal confine ucraino, precisamente nel Donbass occupato dalle truppe ucraine, poco a nord-est di Lugansk, e sono entrati due blindati ucraini, secondo la ricostruzione che ha dato Rianovosti. Sono entrati due blindati ucraini BPM e hanno ingaggiato battaglia con le truppe dell'esercito russo e sono stati distrutti. Non si hanno dettagli sul come è stata effettuata la loro distruzione, ma so che a breve distanza c'è appunto l'aeroporto a nord della zona dove è accaduto il fatto. C'è l'aeroporto di Millerovo che ha visto la presenza di diversi elicotteri da combattimento, da attacco, che erano stati spostati qui in tempi recenti durante il rinforzo del confine a ovest, appunto, da parte dell'esercito russo. Era in corso tra l'altro il Consiglio di Sicurezza russo con il presidente Putin a presiederlo, e ora c'è la conferenza stampa. Quindi ecco che arriva il presidente Putin, quindi gli lascio la parola.
In a couple of words, I would like to remind you about what is happening there, how the situation was unfolding, even though you are perfectly aware of this, but still to have a big picture to help us to make decisions. So after coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014, part of the population of this country, they didn't accept this coup d'etat. I would like to remind it that it was anti-constitutional and blood was spilled because during these events a lot of innocent people were killed, because that was an armed coup d'etat and no one is denying that. So part of the citizens of this country, they didn't accept this coup. It concerned people who lived in Crimea, and also those people who were living and still live in the Donbass area. These people said that they are going to establish two independent republics, Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. Starting from that moment, the confrontation between authorities in Kiev and people who live in this territory has begun, and I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Russia has done all we could to use peaceful tools, to use peaceful means to resolve all the differences. But despite these efforts, Kiev authorities twice launched offensive against people in these territories, and it seems that we are witnessing the escalation of the situation for the third time. All these years, I would like to remind you, the people who live there, basically, they were humiliated. They were shelled all the time, they were blocked. As you all know, people who live close to the front line, they had to live in their basements, so they live there now with their children, basement of their houses. During the negotiations, we came up with a plan to resolve the situation. It's called the Minsk Accords because the negotiations were held in Minsk. But further events showed that today's authorities from Kyiv have no intentions to implement this plan. More than that, they have stated this on a number of occasions already, at the highest state level
Kiev
and
non ha intenzione di
at the level of the
implementare il piano di
at the
pace di
level
Minsk.
of the Security Council Secretary, so it is obvious for everyone that in the context, in the framework of these Minsk Accords, they are not going to do anything. Nevertheless, Russia is still making attempts to resolve all these complications, all these tragic events with peaceful means, in peaceful way, but we have what we have. Our goal, the agenda for today's meeting is to hear everyone out and to come up with our further steps, next steps in this track. What I mean is the request from the heads of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic to recognize their sovereignty, their independence, and to restore State Duma of the request made by the State Duma of the Russian Federation about this. So they made a request for the head of state to do this, to recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and of the Lugansk People's Republic. At the same time, I would like to say that all these matters are closely related. These are different matters, but still they are closely related to the global problems of security in the world and in Europe in particular. Because using Ukraine as a tool of confrontation from our side, so to us, it is a big threat. That's exactly why, in recent months, in the end of the last year, we escalated our work with our counterparts in Washington and in NATO to come to an agreement about the security measures and to do everything we can to continue develop the country under peaceful circumstances. For us, it's a priority. To our country, it's a priority. Not a confrontation, but enhancing security and providing necessary conditions to continue to grow. But we need to understand current realities. And as I have said on a number of occasions, if Russia is going to face this threat, like Ukraine joining North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, then a threat to our country will increase tenfold, because there is Article 5 of the Treaty Organization, and it says that all the allied countries, they have to join the military actions on behalf of one of its members if there is aggression against its member. And since no one wants to recognize the referendum in Crimea, and Ukraine insists that it's their territory, we face a real threat that they will want to fight for this territory that they claim belongs to them with military means, and it is stated in their documents, in their papers. Then the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this military bloc, will have to join these actions. We are told, and you know that some countries, some NATO members are against of Ukraine becoming a member of the alliance. Nevertheless, despite them being against this, in 2008 in Bucharest, they signed a memorandum that opens doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. When I asked, why did you do that? I got no response. We were pressured into this by the United States. That was the response. Well, if they did this step, being pressured by the United States, what guarantees do we have that they won't make next steps in these directions? We have no such guarantees. There could be no such guarantees because the United States can renounce any agreements previously reached. They can withdraw from any documents they sign. But nevertheless, at least something should be put in writing, should become a legally binding document, but we can't reach terms about this. So that's how I suggest we work. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Lavrov, who is now trying to come to an agreement with Washington, with Brussels, with NATO regarding the security guarantees. And then I would like to ask Mr. Kozak. I asked him to join us today. He's here, I can see that. I would like him to give us his estimates about what is going on with the negotiations on implementation of the Minsk agreements. Then I will give the floor to every one of you, but eventually we must come to a conclusion what we will do next. What should we do? Coming from the situation that we have now, coming from our estimations of how it could develop. So please, Mr. Lavrov, the floor is yours.
Parla Lavrov.
Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, I reported to Mr. President a week ago. We prepared an estimation of... I reported to Mr. President a week ago. We prepared an estimation of the proposals on security guarantees that Russia proposed last December, and in January we got the response, and this response shows that our Western counterparts are not ready to see our central proposals regarding the non-expansion of NATO to the east, so this demand was renounced. They refer to the open doors policy, the so-called open doors policy, and the freedom of choice for the states to find means of protecting their security. And they didn't suggest any alternative to this key demand, neither in the US response nor in NATO's response. The principle of indivisibility of security that we refer to the United States are trying to avoid talking about this, and they just taking out one single element that they are happy with, the freedom of choosing military alliances. They ignore everything else, including the key conditions that state that no one, when choosing alliances, should not strengthen one's security at the expense of security of others. In this regard, late January, I sent to all our colleagues from Western Europe, to NATO members, to EU members, and Switzerland, we sent letters that provided our analysis adopted at the OSCE at the highest level in 1999 and in 2010, and also the Founding Act of 1997 and the Rome Declaration that was approved at the highest level in 2002 at the meeting of Russia-NATO Council in Pratica di Mare. Our second priority concerns the period when we started relations with NATO in 1997, and we proposed, keeping in mind that in those documents from 1997 it was stated that Russia and NATO are no adversaries anymore, and we were going to build partnership relations, including strategic partnership. We suggested to return to the configuration in the east of NATO, to the configuration, to the state of 1997, to restore this configuration. This argument of ours was refuted, just like the first one, and at the same time, in their responses, NATO people urged us to stop occupation of Crimea, to withdraw troops from Georgia, Moldavia, and Ukraine. As for Ukraine, they support the Minsk Accords and these documents, but in a sterile key, without any willingness to force Kyiv to implement this essential document. And in response to our other demands, including the need to stop deploying threatening weapon system next to the Russian borders, Americans said that they were ready to start discussing the issue of short-ranged and medium-ranged missiles, land-based missiles. This problem started when the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the INF treaty with the Russian Federation and ignored your, Mr. Putin, initiative that you came up with 2 years ago when you suggested to replace this treaty with a moratorium to deploy such systems with corresponding verification measures. Among other ideas that the US and NATO responded to us with, we can work on the decreasing military risks to increase transparency and predictability. That is close to our proposals that we have reiterated on a number of occasions in recent years, both to Americans and to NATO members. But these topics, they are taken out of the context regarding the package of security guarantees, and as for bilateral steps with the US, they also talk about regulating the planes flights and coming up with the regulation how to prevent conflicts for the military vessels and restoring the context between the military, establishing civilian hotline, and discussing mechanism of preventing dangerous military incidents. In overall, our impression is that our counterparts are trying to fragment Russian proposals, to single out secondary matters, even though they are still important to us, to still be engaged in the dialogue, but they try to avoid talking about the key matters of expansion of NATO. They don't want to limit their freedom regarding the configuration of the forces in the NATO space and the space around NATO territory, which is especially important in the context of the topic that Mr. President talked about, the start of any dialogue conditioned by our steps on de-escalating situation around Ukraine. And summing up the estimation of the responses we got, we can say that so there is some progress, small progress, but still there is, and consistency and the principled position that we've been manifesting when we suggested our initiatives from the last December. It shook up the United States and its allies, and it made them to start working on many items, many Russian proposals on de-escalating, on reducing the tension, military tension, and regarding a lot of matters in arms control. So in this context, we come from the assumption that we should continue this work, and we reacted to the document that we got from Washington and Brussels, but we only reacted to the US proposals, first of all, because we consider the NATO track as auxiliary one, because NATO members are going to choose their next steps, first of all, and maybe even exclusively, depending on the Washington's position. And during the Munich conference on security matters, every person from the West was declaring its adherence to the unified position, and this unified position is created by the United States. And it only proves that we have to talk with Washington, and that's what we are doing. We have sent the response approved by you, a response to the American document we got. In our document, we emphasize the most important thing, that our proposals is not something like a menu you can choose items from, and that's not an ultimatum. But they are based on absolutely obvious thing, that the situation in the world can only be resolved in complex. You, Mr. Putin, emphasized that the Ukrainian crisis depends on the relations between the Russian Federation and the Western countries led by the United States are developing. That's why in our response we emphasized the unity of our position, and we are ready to talk about the matters that the Americans now finally remembered, including with our suggestions, but we will only do that when we will receive the response to our key topics, our main concerns: non-expansion of NATO to the east, and considering the configuration of NATO presence in Europe, first of all in Central and Eastern Europe, with the agreement that Russia and NATO reached in mind. And of course our urge, not even an urge, demand really, to explain why these papers that were signed at the highest level, that no one is going to strengthen their security at the expense of security of others. So they are not just ignored, but a lot of our colleagues, they refuse to explain what they meant when their leaders signed that document. And why now? Regardless of what they meant, they are not going to implement their own obligations. And as per your instruction, Mr. Putin, after we sent these documents to Washington, I got a phone call from Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State. He said that he familiarized with our document and he's ready to meet, to talk about it, and to talk about the American reaction, and maybe to add some additional questions. And if you agree, we have planned this meeting this week on 24th of February in Geneva. So we will come from the positions approved by you, from the stance approved by you, and that you are protecting in talks with your counterparts. And of course, we are going to promote this position also in the foreign ministry. Just a minute. So I talked to my counterparts about this, and my American counterpart assured me that they are not going to let Ukraine in tomorrow, so there even could be some kind of a moratorium. But they think that Ukraine is not ready yet. So my answer was simple. So you're talking about implementation of your plans. You just think that you need to take some time to prepare Ukraine. So that's not a moratorium for us. That's not a concession. So that's for you. So that's not a meeting halfway. That's not a step towards us. We talked twice with the President of France. So last night, even this morning, we talked until 2 a.m. and he assured me that there are some changes, some shifts in the American stance, but when I asked what are these changes, he didn't give me any answer. So I believe that first we need to understand what are these changes, if there are any, because your counterpart.
Sospendo un attimo perché devo prendere appunti.
There are no changes regarding the principled matters about other countries joining NATO, about expansion of NATO. So there are no changes. Did I get that right? Despite a lot of publications in media, in Western media, of the classified documents that were discussed in the early 1990s between our Western counterparts among themselves or with us. And they state that there should be no intention. So when they talked to each other, they said they had no intention to expand NATO, to enlarge NATO. And despite that, Mr. Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, is just refuting the facts, unclassified documents from the British archive and published in Der Spiegel. And despite all this, so they say they are not going to change, to weaken this policy of open doors, despite you said yourself on a number of occasions that there is no such policy. There is just an opportunity in the treaty they signed. If all the NATO members agree, they can offer some country, any country, to join the alliance on two conditions, if it corresponds to the membership conditions and if it strengthened the security of the North Atlantic Treaty. So the second criteria is ignored, that we know already. But as for the new ideas, Americans and their allies can share with us. So we come from the assumption that, like you said, to President Macron, first we need to understand what Americans actually mean, what they have in mind. And since our French counterparts, they tell us that they have this understanding of what Washington can talk to us. And today, like you agreed with President Macron yesterday, so I'm going to have a phone conversation with the French foreign minister. And when we agreed about the time of this phone conversation, I asked the French foreign ministry to make sure that this conversation, my counterpart would clarify what Americans are going to discuss with us. Please. Somehow. Thank you very much. You can take your seat. So now we will give the floor to Mr. Kozak. I asked him to give us an overview of what was happening during the Minsk track of the settlement, and then I would like to ask other members of the Security Council to talk, starting from the real situation that we have now in the People's Republics of Donbass.
Mr. President, colleagues, I won't delve into details of these extremely complex talks.
If you could be a little louder.
And today it's obvious that Ukraine or its Western allies don't need Donbass on any conditions. They want to freeze this conflict and to blame Russia politically, and they've already are successful about this. The West believes that Russia is responsible for this conflict, and to blame Russia for the economic consequences for Donbass. And you all know how much it costs us to provide humanitarian aid to these territories. And just some recent figures, our state program has some issues, and lately we've had a spike in economic rise. And today we have 2.5 times more workplaces than workers available. And we are working to solve these economic issues. Donbass is obviously isn't needed to Ukraine or to the West. They want to freeze this conflict. And when asked about what conditions do they have to return Donbass under the Ukrainian control, they don't know how to answer to this. There is no need to talk about the reasons, economic. Oh, no.
No, you just tell us about negotiations, about the Minsk Accord. So what state of affairs in this regard?
The process hasn't gone anywhere. It's where it was in 2015. The dialogue on the future status of Donbass should have started right after removing heavy weapons from the front line, and it happened on the 8th of March 2015, and by the end of 2015 the amendments should have been introduced to the Constitution, and special legislation, special status of these territories, then elections, and then the end of the conflict with providing full control to Ukraine over this territory. And this dialogue hasn't gone anywhere. And it is evident that Ukraine sees these territories as districts, municipal districts of Ukraine without any special status, and the people there believe that there is no reason to provide special status to these territories. Don't want to give the right to the language or have their own police enforcement, and this may cause other territories to ask for such rights as well, because there is a demand for such rights in other regions of Ukraine. They are confident about this. They will never agree to Minsk agreements, though they announce that they support these agreements to the public.
Yesterday, I talked, like I said, again with my French counterpart, and he claims that the current leadership of Ukraine is ready to implement the Minsk Accords, and more than that, they are coming up with some new, fresh ideas of how they can be implemented, including the elections using the famous Steinmeier formula, the current president of Germany.
Again, over 8 years they've learned how to do this. They're telling lies about Minsk agreements. We have all the documents in the Normandy format, and there is something written there, and they say that this really another thing. And in September of last year, there was talk about Russia being a side of this conflict. All right, let it be a side. Let's have some conditions for us, and they cannot format anything about it. And we ask them to provide some commitments for us. Now let the Normandy format countries find these provisions. And we have a lot of proposals on Minsk agreements. And we can't formulate what Donbass isn't doing.
So why is that they don't know that what Donbass is not doing under Minsk Accords?
Yes, they don't know what are Russia's commitments or Donbass's.
And could you please clear this thing out about item 9, 11 and 12, because it says there that these decisions must be made in consultation and in dialogue with these republics.
They think that despite what's written and what everybody knows,
noto che il presidente Putin incalza con le domande, vuole più precisione nelle risposte.
For direct dialogue between Ukraine and Donbass.
So the things that are there about the dialogue, about consultation, they think it doesn't mean to be in direct dialogue. Yesterday, Macron told you that we need to keep this dialogue under the OSCE observation and the trilateral contact group, and that's a made-up problem because this dialogue is only happening within the trilateral contact group, and that is moderated and facilitated by OSCE. So it's a made-up problem. There is no problem like that. All the suggestions made regarding the Donbass are made through the trilateral group, and we are trying to discuss it with the OSCE, but Ukrainian representatives, while the Donbass representatives are saying something, they turn their heads away. They don't listen. And when they are asked to respond, they say, if Russia is asking something, we will respond. And when Russia is asking, when will you amend the constitution? Because about 2 years ago in Berlin, we asked that, when are you going to amend the constitution in accordance with the Minsk Accords? The very next day in Ukraine, they started this hysteria that Russia is interfering with internal affairs of Ukraine. They are making ultimatums about amending the constitution of Ukraine, which is sovereign right of Ukraine, and no one has any right to interfere with that. So did I get that right? That Kiev authorities don't want to engage in direct dialogue with the republics. They say they want to do it by dialogue with Russia. And as soon as Russia offers certain steps to settle within the framework of the Minsk Accords, they start saying that Russia is interfering with internal affairs of Ukraine. That's absolutely how it is. And they want this. They try to make Russia react.
Sembra che stiano facendo
They want us to
il punto su tutte le cose che non vanno, i punti morti, i vicoli ciechi dove sono andati a finire nelle trattative. Sia Lavrov, che ha detto una cosa importante. Lavrov ha detto: abbiamo risposto agli USA in quanto la NATO risponde a loro. I paesi membri, eccetera, non prendono posizioni se non quelle di Washington. E poi ha detto un'altra cosa: la nostra proposta non è un menù da cui scegliere quello che ti va di trattare e quello che non ti va di trattare, che è in fondo quello che hanno fatto gli USA in maniera assolutamente indecorosa. Stanno facendo il punto di una situazione che va affrontata. Ho paura di andare avanti.
suggest something regarding the Constitution, then they blame us of interfering with their affairs. And what about interpreting the Minsk Accords in such a way that they are not unrecognized republics should come up with initiatives, but the other way around? Kiev authorities of today, they should come up with certain suggestions on how Minsk agreements should be implemented. That was the last suggestion, last proposal they did on February 10th in Berlin, so it was just some crazy, from legal point of view, suggestion about the initiative of amending Ukrainian law. So it should only come, the initiative should only come from Ukraine. Okay, so there is initiative, but some new tricks every time. And it all comes down to the fact that Ukrainian suggestions about amending their constitution, about their law, no one can discuss that because that's the sovereign right of Ukraine. If Russia does that, then that's interference. If the Donbass does that, then these are separatists who also don't have this right, can't exercise this right. So unexpectedly, this stance was supported by France yesterday. And that key item of the Minsk agreements that states that all these changes, including amendments of the constitution, it must be agreed with DPR and LPR, they are being ignored. They are being ignored. They come up with all kinds of tricks, and these tricks, these schemes are really stupid from legal point of view. Let us just throw something to this trilateral contact group. We are not going to talk to anyone. We are not going to listen to Donbass. Most likely the reaction would be like I described, and then OSCE could say that within the framework of this black box of this trilateral contact group, so allegedly it was approved there. But that's a made-up procedure that leads to nowhere. So, okay, then my final question to you. Could you please tell me and our colleagues, what, in your opinion, Kiev authorities are going to implement the Minsk agreements or not? If the situation doesn't change, they won't. They will never implement it. Once again, it is obvious that they do not want to, neither within the framework of the Minsk agreements or not. They don't want to bring Donbass back to Ukraine. And Mr. Putin, or maybe I could say that later, I wanted to take that question about if we should, what we should do with Donbass, how should we talk with the West, because it's a very serious matter. Should we annex Donbass or not? So let's stick to the topic of your statement. Let's limit ourselves to that. And as for the negotiations within the framework of the Minsk agreements and about your estimates of its future, the way we understand that there is no future of this kind of work, but at the same time, within the framework of Minsk agreements, so there is no future, it holds no future to continue talking about it. Now I would like to ask the director of the Federal Security Service to report about the situation that we have at the border, and about refugees who are crossing the border now, and about the situation at the border in general. Mr. Putin, we can see how the situation is getting worse in those two republics, Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. The shelling has intensified, which is a threat to the lives of the civilians. So keeping this in mind, refugees started moving towards the border with Russia, and as per 9 a.m. today, from Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, 68.5 thousand civilians moved towards the border. That's the information we got from the border guards, and we work in contact with the regional authorities that work with refugees, and that's first. And secondly, we can see that the result of intensified shelling by Ukrainian military of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, there are some cases when shells hit the territory of the Russian Federation, first of all, the Rostov region, and keeping that in mind, both us and the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, so we have launched a probe into that. And secondly, early this morning, two groups of saboteurs tried to trespass the border of Russia, and as a result of the firefight between them and our border troops, border guards, these two groups were destroyed. One of the servicemen was captured, so now we continue to work. In this regard, the situation guards, how the situation is getting worse in those two republics, Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. The shelling has intensified, which is a threat to the lives of the civilians. So keeping this
Riascolto un
in
attimo
mind,
perché non mi è
refugees
sfuggito
started
qualcosa.
moving towards the border with Russia, and as per 9 a.m. today, from Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, 68.5 thousand civilians moved towards the border. That's the information we got from the border guards, and we work in contact with the regional authorities that work with refugees, and that's first. And secondly, we can see that the result of intensified shelling by Ukrainian military of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. There are some
Quindi ha detto
cases when shells
68.500 sfollati.
hit the territory of the Russian Federation, first of all, the Rostov region, and keeping that in mind, both us and the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, so we have launched a probe into that. And secondly, early this morning, two groups of saboteurs tried to trespass the border of Russia, and as a result of the firefight between them and our border troops, border guards, these two groups were destroyed. One of the servicemen was captured, so now we continue to work. In this regard, the situation at the border is stable, so we are monitoring the situation, and we have enhanced our border guards, and we work with the local police and border troops. Thank you, Mr. Shoigu. I know that the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation is following the developments in the conflict zone, so please, if we could hear out your estimates. Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, talking about the estimates of what is going on today, on 19th and 20th of February, more than 100 of shelling and heavy weaponry was used, mortars as a result of the actions both from the saboteurs and artillery. Donetsk, so they have run out of water. At least 90% of the city population have no access to water. As for Lugansk, 2/3 of the city, they have no gas. And practically all the people who lived along the contact line, so they were forced to evacuate, and a small portion of the people who had to stay there, who had to continue working there, because there are some enterprises that can't be stopped. Unfortunately, they are suffering, and today at the bus stop, as a result of shell bomb hitting it, one miner was killed. And in total, over the night, if we talk about all the directions, more than 40 instances of shelling were registered. In our understanding, the way we see it, and the reports we get from the experts, it is done. So the certain goals are shelled, so that's not just some random fire, so they know what they want to hit, and they aim these particular targets. And I would like to briefly report to you about what is amassed next to the borders with Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic. So, next to the borders, thousands of troops, as a result of your negotiations, lengthy negotiations about the security measures, the troops and heavy weaponry, first of all, they were supposed to be withdrawn from the contact line to the fire range so that they couldn't reach the settlements there, and now we can see happening the contrary, so this heavy weaponry is brought back to these positions. So what we have there of today, 59,000 of troops. As for the weapons launchers, 345 tanks, 2,160 armored vehicles, 820 mortar guns, cannons, and the Smerch systems. And I also would like to draw your attention to the fact that this does not include those nationalist battalions. A lot is said about, a lot is written about, and due to our data, they are not really controlled by the authorities and by their commanders locally, and so they do whatever they deem appropriate. That's why we have these saboteurs that emerge in various places, and that's why we witness terrorist attacks, car bombings, power station or gas pipeline, blowing up of this infrastructure. And I would also like to draw the attention of the members of the Security Council to the statement made by Mr. Zelensky that they would like to return the status of the nuclear country. I won't say nuclear power, but country. That is a very dangerous thing. First, because while they were part of the Soviet Union, they have the necessary infrastructure to build such weapons, not only weapons, but carriers for such a weapon. And incidentally, if we talk about tactical nuclear weapons in Germany, so there still are, and it can also be brought and used with the carriers that already exist. I already said about point.
Ha detto che l'Ucraina quindi può diventare una potenza nucleare perché facendo parte dell'Unione Sovietica ha le infrastrutture necessarie a produrre quanto serve.
So these launchers could be used for this kind of weaponry. So they have know-how, they have experts, they have trained personnel, and so they're much closer to using this kind of weapon than Iran and North Korea that is being discussed at various levels. And so there are a lot of agreements about trying to denuclearize these states. And adding to this are those nationalist units, battalions that are created across the entire country, across Ukraine, and it's no secret to anyone. They are controlling the situation that emerges in various districts and various cities of Ukraine. What I mean is everything related to the ultra-radical nationalist views and statements regarding Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea, and of course in regard of our country. In overall, the situation is very tense. Starting from February 14th, we observe the efforts to basically bring the upper level of this military readiness pyramid. So they are reaching this stage, which says that they either prepare large-scale serious provocation or they want to resolve the Donbass matter with force, at the very least. So we can see the heavy machinery and artillery being relocated and changing the radio frequency in their radio talks, and other than that, everything that is related, or first of all related to the activities at the front line. What I mean is shelling, so we haven't seen anything like that for a long time, and we are witnessing what we witnessed in 2014, 2015, very close to that. Thank you, dear colleagues. As for the negotiations regarding the settlement of the Donbass situation, I think it's clear to everyone the situation that we have there. So it has been described in a lot of detail by the director of the Federal Security Service and the defense minister alike. Now we need to answer the question raised a long time ago, and that is stipulated in the appeal of the State Duma to the head of state. The question about recognizing of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. All the threats and blackmail that we see from the West, we see it, we know why they do it, but we also see the situation that we have now. Mr. Medvedev. Mr. Putin, your colleagues, Mr. Putin and other speakers, they gave us characteristics of the situation that we have, and we talk about security of our country. What I mean is attempt by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the United States of America to redraw the world map to their benefit, to try to come close to our borders and basically to force us into the corner. These are red lines that the President mentioned when he talked at various forums and during various meetings. If we talk about the situation around the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, it's absolutely obvious, at least to me, and which is confirmed by the information we've got from our colleagues. Ukraine doesn't want these territories. At least they just use it as some kind of currency to pay for the status of Ukraine. The people from these territories get no support, no aid from the Ukrainian authorities. There are only reprisals, which is manifested in shelling, taking away simple benefits or violating the most basic human rights. And if we look at the situation in complex, we can make a conclusion that the Minsk agreements are not going to be implemented. And by the obvious reasons, even if there is pressure from the foreign states like France, Germany, most likely, in all likeliness, the current regime in Ukraine, the current president, he doesn't need the implementation of these agreements because it's going to become an obstacle to him winning the second term of his presidency. That's what he wants the most. And so it's not in his interest to implement the agreements that were reached. That's what you, Mr. President, said when both him and his defense secretary, security council secretary, they say that these are harmful agreements. And then they continue to make some blatant lies to our Western colleagues when they just say some words for the sake of saying these words about them adhering to the fact of implementing the Minsk agreements. We have an important dilemma in front of us about recognizing these two territories that are ready and willing to seek such recognition, that appealed to us with these requests, and our parliament also made such decision. I remember well the year 2008, and I can speak from the experience of the decisions I had to make back then about recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, so to give them, from our point of view, to make them the subject of international law. We all know what happened next. I'm not going to speak about this now because there are a lot of problems, there are a lot of difficulties in this regard. But at the same time, it allowed to save hundreds of thousands of lives. And largely, it served as a lesson for NATO, for a number of European countries, and this lesson was that you can do certain things to the Russian Federation. The situation that we have now is in a way more complicated, but also maybe simpler. I'd like to explain. It is more complicated because the scale of potential conflict can be compared to what we faced in 2008. And that's a fact, keeping in mind the estimation given to us by defense minister just now. But on the other hand, it's easier for us because back then we didn't know the potential reaction. There were all kinds of talks. I talked, Mr. Putin also talked to President Bush. But now we know. We know what is going to happen. We know all the possible problems, all possible difficulties, all the sanction ideas that we can hear now broadcast from every domestic appliance. We know that there will be a lot of pressure, but at the same time we know how to withstand this pressure. So in this sense, that bitter experience that we had in these 14 years, I think so we learned from this experience and it was beneficial to us, and that experience showed that it is going to be difficult, and I can share my estimate, my personal estimate. But after some time, if the situation is managed sensibly, and once again, I think that we learn to do this with the help of our president. This tension that is literally vibrating around our country, one way or another, it is going to decrease. It is not going to happen in one moment, but that's how the history works, history of mankind, that sooner or later people get tired from such situations, and they will be the ones to ask us to go back to negotiations, to talks regarding all the matters of strategic security. And you know, like Bulgakov wrote in his famous work, you should never ask for anything. They will come and they will offer you everything. So that's how things turned out and unfolded in 2008. They were the ones to come. They were the ones to restore the relations on all avenues, on all tracks. Because I have to be direct, I have to be frank. Russia, for international community, for our friends from the United States, from the European Union, Russia means much more than Ukraine, and everyone understands that, including Ukrainians. That's why, of course, we should try to avoid escalation, but the rules of this game are so that after some time, this situation about recognizing these territories, so it will calm down. Our experience shows that, proves that. I would like also to say something that has been said yet. It's a basic thing, but it's an essential thing, nevertheless. In those two unrecognized territories, there are about 800,000 Russian citizens live now. What I mean, not even the Russian world that we're trying to protect and help and support. I'm talking about the citizens of Russia. Citizens who live in a foreign state. These are our fellow citizens. These are not just people who speak Russian. They are citizens of our country. It is obvious to everyone that when some problems arise, for example, with American citizens, if someone gets captured somewhere, Americans, they will launch a special operation to rescue them. So the way I see it, as being members of the Security Council, we cannot ignore this fact. That's why, in my opinion, if the situation will continue to unfold in such a way I have just described, and we see no signs of improvement, then the only way out is to recognize these territories as subjects of international law, which is something that the president of the country can do. But with all the signs we are witnessing, this situation is not going to improve. You said, Mr. Putin, and I think it is a very important thing to think about. We should hear it from our population, from our citizens, because we all share this one house, one home, and so...
Il punto è stato molto importante. Il punto che ha toccato Medvedev è molto importante. Abbiamo 800.000 cittadini russi che vivono in Donetsk e Lugansk. Se gli americani si trovassero in una situazione così, agirebbero per salvaguardare i loro cittadini. Quindi dice, se la situazione non dovesse cambiare, noi dobbiamo riconoscere i territori. È stato molto chiaro.
There are a lot of complicated things, including military component, but from what I know, the vast majority of our citizens would support this step. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Medvedev. You can now take your seat. I would like to address everyone attending. Each one of you knows. And I would like to underscore this. I didn't discuss anything with any of you in advance. I didn't ask for your opinions beforehand. And what is happening now? It is happening on the blank page, so to say, because I wanted to know your opinions without any preparation from your side. I think it's a very important thing to remember, and I would like to ask the chairman of the State Duma to speak now.
Presidente della Duma.
Mr. President, colleagues, the State Duma has agreed on a decision. We've weighted all possibilities, and the majority, 351 member, agreed to address President to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. Initially, we wanted to provide a draft to the Foreign Ministry and other authorities. The situation in those republics is critical, and we had humanitarian concerns, first of all. The people are dying, this isn't going to end soon. And we believe that Kyiv is purposefully freezing the process. This is unacceptable. So, when making this decision, we took into account the fact that our citizens live there, and around 1,200,000 Russian-speaking people live there, and 800,000 acquired Russian citizenship. And over the last 8 years, the situation hasn't changed. And despite inviting other countries to the process, the Ukrainian side undermines all its undertakings, and we asked to recognize the Lugansk and Donetsk Republic.
Thank you, Ms. Matvienko. Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, 7 years in the very heart of Europe, we are witnessing a humanitarian disaster. All these years, genocide, blockade, no retirement welfare, shelling, and for 7 years, Russia has consistently, at all levels, advocated for political, diplomatic settlement of the intra-Ukrainian conflict, which is basically putting an end to civil war at all levels, and also in the parliament. We talked about this. No one hit us. No one listened to us. They were just imitating implementation of the Minsk Accords. Endless meetings of the contact groups that made no sense, that brought no fruit. And it became obvious that the puppets from the Kiev regime, it's not that they do not want to make any decisions, they can't make any decisions. So when Biden snaps his fingers, that's very day the Attorney General is being fired. And if they wanted the conflict in Ukraine to be over, they just need to make an instruction to the Kiev leadership. That very day, they would sit down at the negotiating table and they would implement the Minsk agreements. Ukraine needs this conflict to justify somehow their degrading economical situation, social situation. They use it as a justification for that. So they need this as an anti-Russian project, and Ukraine is just being used there. They are not thinking about their national interest. They only think about what their masters think, what their masters do. It's just a bargaining chip. That's why the Minsk agreements are not being implemented. What Donetsk and Lugansk people wanted, they were called separatists, terrorists, and they only said, give us autonomous economy because we don't want to feed Kiev anymore, and give us right to speak our native tongue, Russian. These are just some basic demands, basic European values they speak so much about. And instead of that, there were 2 attempts of seizing their territories with armed means, with a lot of victims, with a lot of casualties, so they made the situation a humanitarian disaster. Where are the OSCE? Where are the guarantors who, before the coup d'etat, signed an agreement? Heads of state are sitting together, Germany, France, and Russia, they make a certain decision, and no one even tried to implement those decisions. Steinmeier formula, it seems such a simple document, so because it describes the order of things, of actions, because for Ukraine it's a territory, and to us these are people, these are citizens, they speak Russian, doesn't matter if they're Russian or Ukrainians. And the worst thing the West is doing, they are trying to clash 2 Slavic peoples against each other, and the people from Lugansk and Donetsk, they are hostages to this anti-Russian project. For how much longer we can try to convince them or to explain to them? We eventually have to make a decision. We were patient enough. We came up with enough arguments to make Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements, to follow the peaceful diplomatic path. Obviously, it's not part of their plan. They don't want to do that, and they are not going to do that. And you should see things for what they are. And the fact that the people of Lugansk and Donetsk rebelled against this anti-constitutional bloody coup d'etat, when the very first decree in the parliament was a decree about canceling, banning Russian language, and when our partners say that, yes, you should implement the Minsk agreements, that was adopted by the United Nations organization, and instead of making them do that, they are pointing finger at us, they are threatening us with sanctions instead of forcing them to peace, forcing Ukraine to peace. Instead of that, they start military exploration of Ukraine. They supplied them with all kinds of weapons, including offensive weapons. Do they even think that nationalists could come to power tomorrow? The followers of Bandera, those people who can be given any other name, and they will use these weapons. Will it add any stability to the situation in Europe? Is that a path towards peaceful and stable relations in Europe? I think that Russia has this moral obligation to do that. You know, I can't watch that footage anymore. I think that's how the majority feels. These poor women, old ladies, are crying, children who have to hide in the basement, have to learn their lessons there, and the world is looking at that, trying to close their eyes. What kind of European values you can even talk about after that? That's anti-humane, anti-moral. And once again, I would like to say that we can't stand this any longer. We have to make a decision. If recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic will resolve this problem, which is obvious, then that's the step we have to make. Obviously, they are going to threaten us with sanctions, and it is going to be painful, but we are called aggressors, and we have never even talked about sanctions against Ukraine. We still supply, like Belarus, power and gasoline there, and they use this gasoline to fuel the tanks that are now moving towards the border with Donetsk and Lugansk. We supply gas and a lot of other things. That's why, in my view, the time has come. We can't postpone it any longer. We have to make a decision. And another thing, just a couple of words. I'm sorry if I'm being too emotional, but in over 30 years of coexisting next to each other as independent states, what wrong did Russia ever do to Ukraine? We have supplied almost for free gas to them. We have never interfered, unlike the United States, who were stating that they spent $5 billion to change the regime, to topple the regime. We didn't interfere. So the Americans wanted to have Yushchenko elected unlawfully, and they did. We didn't interfere with the elections. We allowed the Ukrainian people to choose a president for themselves. All these 30 years, we have never had it on our agenda about unlawful handing Crimea and Sevastopol to Ukraine. Yes, it was harmful because more than 200 years ago, Catherine the Great signed a decree that Crimea are voluntarily becoming a part of the Russian Empire. For more than 200 years, the Black Sea Fleet is stationed there, which is older than some of the states, but we have never raised these topics. And we have to start protecting them, because battalions of the Bandera followers were walking there, marching there, and the people were burned alive. Police officers at Maidan were killed. People were burned alive in Odessa just to intimidate. And that was just the beginning. We can't even imagine what they would have done in Crimea and Sevastopol. That's why Russia supported the choice of the people of Crimea. Just admit this fact. We followed strictly the UN Charter, which stipulates that the nations have right for self-determination. If there is a decision of the UN Court, ruling of the UN Court, and all these arguments are well known to everyone. Yes, they wanted to have, instead of the Black Sea Navy of the Russian Federation, they wanted to see NATO flag in Sevastopol. But we have no moral right to allow this thing to happen. So this page is turned. We have to recognize it for what it is now. It's high time now to make this decision, because we can't talk it over any longer, to pretend that things are being done. That would be an immoral thing to do. Thank you. Mr. Patrushev. Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, the matters that we are discussing today, so it's very pressing, very urgent, but I would like to look at this situation at a wider angle. The United States of America, so in their doctrine, just like China, so they see us as an enemy. And that's the line they pursue almost everywhere. So from the stance that we are their enemies. And I would like to underscore as well, we are saying that we are negotiating with NATO, we are negotiating with OSCE, we are negotiating with the European Union, with the heads of European states. We need to negotiate, but the negotiations should be done with the United States. Everyone else, the rest, they will do what the US tells them. That's what NATO does, OSCE, European Union, and so on and so forth. So the main negotiator with whom we need to talk is the States. Just look, Mr. Lavrov says they want to have another summit between the President of the United States, Biden, and President of Russia, Putin. And they don't say what topics they want to discuss, just a summit to talk about something, just to say that we are engaged in dialogue and so on. But we don't need plain talks anymore. We need to achieve concrete goals, because they are hiding what is their agenda, what is their goal, which is destroying the Russian Federation, make it collapse. And our goal is to protect the territorial integrity of our country and the sovereignty of our country. As for the conflict in Ukraine and about what is happening there, everyone knows that. Not the people of Ukraine did that. The people of Ukraine are against that. They are being intimidated. They are being forced to follow this path. And it was done by the United States, exactly like in 2008 with Georgia, when the decision was made about that as well. So the only country we need to negotiate with is the United States. As for Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, so the people have suffered enough. We can't keep torturing them. And the fact that the Duma made that decision, that's only fair. And I understand that we must support both the decision that Duma is recommending to you and the President to adopt, to make. And I think if that's what we are going to do, we will both protect the people who live there, and we need to think about that as well. And at the same time, we will give them an opportunity to continue working calmly. But again, what is going on there is just one of the local conflicts that was organized, plotted by the United States. So my suggestion is to respond to the suggestion of the Americans, to the suggestion, to the proposal of Mr. Biden to have summit with him. And during these negotiations, we could say that you did everything against the people of the Lugansk People's Republic, Donetsk People's Republic, and we must support them. If you can, in the shortest term, we can talk about 2 or 3 days, stop all this bloodbath, then we can start a dialogue, and then they can negotiate with each other, and they can implement not the roadmap of the Minsk agreement, but the actual plan, so that there was a short term of implementing that for each item. But I'm convinced that you will get a no in response. They won't agree with you. So the only possible decision then is recognition. Thank you. Mr. Mishustin.
Mr. President, colleagues, for many months we've been preparing for a possible reaction on recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and the analysis of all risks we can encounter if we do this. We've analyzed these risks. We understand the limitations we will have, especially in terms of technology input. We've also have several groups under the Ministry of Finance to prepare responses, including the response of the Bank of Russia. And it is evident that the situation will deteriorate, and Russian economy will have a downfall. But that's the only way we can achieve our national economic goals you've set. We'll do everything we can to ensure economic development and wealth of our people.
So you support this appeal?
I've heard what the previous speaker said, and if we want to capitalize on this, we need to recognize the Republic.
Thank you.
Сергей Евгеньевич. Уважаемый Владимир Владимирович, мы в течение долгого времени видим
for a long time now we see this, and I'm reporting to you about the fact that the current authorities of Ukraine are not planning to implement the Minsk Agreement. President of Ukraine and in his inner circle, he says, and he can say whatever he wants publicly about the Minsk Agreement. He can say, and I think that in this situation, we must. I would like to agree with what Mr. Patrushev said, with his suggestion that we can give our Western partners the last chance to offer them to force Kiev to choose the peaceful path and to implement the Minsk agreements. Otherwise, we have to make the decision we are discussing today. What do you mean otherwise? You want us to start the negotiations? Or you want us to recognize the sovereignty? Just say it directly. I would support the suggestion about recognition. I will support, or I am supporting. I am supporting. So yes or no, just say it. Yes, I am supporting the suggestion about making Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to make them part of the Russian Federation. That's not what we are talking about. That's not what we are discussing. We are talking about recognizing them as independent entities. Yes or no? Yes, I support the suggestion about recognizing their independence. Thank you. You can take your seat. Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, we can always find some examples in the history of the processes that we are witnessing now. This point of view of today's Kiev lived before the occupation by the armed forces of Ukraine, from Mariupol and ending with the historical borders. Thank you. As for negotiations, Mr. Kozak said that we are deadlocked. For 8 years we have been negotiating, so that's something to remember. So I would like someone else to take the floor now, so to talk about your own position, but we will assume that you will talk on behalf of your colleagues as well. If there is any need from the representatives to talk more about their point of view, then we will give them the floor. Mr. Putin, dear members of the Security Council, we all remember 2014 and the pain our people had when they looked at what was happening in Crimea and what started to happen in Donbass and Lugansk. And we remember this desire from the public to recognize those three. When attending, do we have any protecting the lives of our fellow citizens too aggressively? So I think we must recognize Lugansk and Donbass. So now I would like to ask everyone attending, do we have any diverging points of view or any diverging opinions about the matters that we are discussing now? No? I know the position of the Foreign Ministry, of the Defense Ministry, of FSB, but still, I would like to ask you, Mr. Lavrov, please. We have heard all arguments for this decision. So wherever we look, it is being done by the West. It is being implemented with pleasure by the Ukrainian authorities, despite all agreements and despite all cases of resolving the inner conflicts. The only conflicts where one of the parties refuses to talk to the other party, and it is fully supported by the West, is the Eastern Ukrainian conflict. Just look at Cyprus, the Northern Cyprus Republic. So the UN is mediating with the talks. Look at Mali, so the French have some problems there. The government is talking to the rebels. The same thing is happening in Ethiopia. Belgrade, Pristina, they are in dialogue. Under the edges of the European Union, everyone is trying to help out with these talks. But another aspect that I see here is something that you've mentioned during the press conference with Olaf Scholz, the term genocide, because genocide has something to do with the history of how Kosovo emerged as an independent state without any kind of referendum. And this, they're trying to support neo-Nazis, the Bandera followers. Also, that's how it manifests. This attack against the Slavic people, against the Orthodox, and in case of Ukraine, against all Russian, which contradicts, as we all know well, it contradicts the constitution of Ukraine, but still it does not prevent the Kiev regime to adapt more and more laws that basically forbid Russian language, not only in schools, not only in universities, but also in daily life. And I really hope that we will send a very strong message to the Russian world. We can't just look idly at how our fellow compatriots, our citizens, are being humiliated. I see no other way. As for the suggestion to give them 2 or 3 days to the West for them to change their minds, so it's up to everyone's taste, but I don't think it will change anything. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shoigu. It's already 2022, and for 8 years now, the people have learned how to survive in basements. From the small ones to the adults, and all this time they haven't implemented a single item. The only thing they did when they withdrew Ukrainian troops from the contact line, and it was only implemented because Ukraine thinks that the day will come, they will gather, muster up strength, they will get a chance, and they will resolve this matter with force. The next page of this book is pumping up Ukraine with weapons. It continues with no one knows what the goal is, no one knows what the idea is. They have so much weaponry, so many weapons, that it will be enough to resolve all kinds of conflicts that they have in Lugansk or in Donetsk. But when every day they receive 4, 5, or even 8 flights of the state-of-the-art weapons, and when they say these are defensive weapons, I have a hard time imagining that javelins is a defensive weapon. And they already have more of those than some of the NATO countries have, which goes to show that no one wants to implement any Minsk agreements. They want to resolve this matter by force. And in this situation, I think we are left with no other choice. So I say it clearly, yes, we must recognize. Thank you. Mr. Putin, for years now, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic and peoples of these republics, they look at Russia with hope and they ask the Russian Federation to protect them and hope to live, to work, to raise their children, to live in peace. And I'm convinced, I'm positive that we need help them to exercise this right and to protect them. I'm convinced that making a decision about recognizing these republics will help. We will help them to fulfill this hope. Mr. Putin, dear colleagues, the Chancellor of Germany said something along the lines that conversations about genocide in Donbass are ridiculous. I would like to look at him. If German people lived there and daily were shelled, what would he say? Would he laugh at it or not? And we discussed that the Ukrainian authorities are ready to implement the Minsk agreements, and the colleagues are saying the right thing. They are stating, and Zelensky is stating, that he's ready to prepare a nuclear arsenal. Then what will happen? We have no borders with Ukraine because we have borders with the Americans because they are the masters and the rest are just puppets and pumping them with weapons, creating the nuclear arsenal in there. So we will remember about it in the future. So I think we need to move forward to continue protecting our country. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues. I have heard your opinions. I will make a decision. Today, I want to thank you for this meeting.
Dunque, abbiamo quindi visto come il presidente Putin, dopo aver sentito tutti, abbia voluto chiedere a ognuno dei componenti principali delle istituzioni democratiche del paese. Abbiamo visto il presidente della Duma, l'ex presidente Medvedev, l'attuale primo ministro, e poi di nuovo ha voluto risentire nuovamente l'opinione di Lavrov e Shoigu. Ha incalzato quel ministro che non si esprimeva in maniera chiara, probabilmente anche perché agitato per il peso di questa decisione che era evidente che sentissero tutti. Ma ciò che... Scusate, avevo lasciato il volume basso. Ciò che... Quindi ricomincio. Quindi abbiamo visto in questo incontro come abbiano voluto fare il punto sulla questione principale, che è il riconoscimento del DPR e LPR, le due repubbliche di Donetsk e Lugansk in parte occupate dall'esercito ucraino. Capite bene che la cosa prevede il riconoscimento dell'intero territorio e quindi un eventuale ultimatum alle forze ucraine per abbandonare il territorio delle repubbliche riconosciute. Hanno fatto presente che ci sono circa 800.000 cittadini russi. Hanno fatto presente che sono state tentate per 8 anni tutte le strade diplomatiche. È stato fatto il punto sulle situazioni dei trattati di Minsk, dell'implementazione, quindi dell'attuazione dei punti, e del fatto che non vi sia volontà da parte di Kiev di implementarli, quindi di attuarli. È stato citato il fatto che ad ogni riunione che fanno si presentano con nuove scuse e nuovi trucchi per per giustificare il fatto che non abbiano mai fatto nulla. Riguardo la modifica della Costituzione hanno detto che non devono interessarsi, i russi non devono interessarsi di quello che fanno nella Costituzione, anche se la sua modifica è prevista negli accordi di Minsk. Hanno ribadito l'escalation militare, quindi il fatto che abbiano ricominciato a bombardare, come un rischio per tutta la popolazione civile. Hanno citato negli 8 anni quello che è veramente un genocidio, quindi una lenta eliminazione della popolazione, anche attraverso lo spingerle a lasciare il paese, quindi si tratta di pulizia etnica, avendo reso impossibile per loro vivere. Ricordiamo le parole di Poroshenko ai tempi, quando diceva che i loro figli cresceranno nelle cantine mentre i nostri andranno a scuola e giocare. Questa è la volontà di sterminio e di rendere impossibile la vita in quei territori da parte delle autorità ucraine. E quindi, stando così le cose, tutti hanno detto uno dopo l'altro, Patrushev e altri, che la situazione in questi termini è inaccettabile e sia necessario quindi riconoscere l'indipendenza delle repubbliche di Donetsk e Lugansk. È un passo molto importante. Putin ha preteso parole chiare da ognuno di loro. Ognuno di loro ha dovuto esprimersi in maniera chiara, ha voluto risentire anche Lavrov e Shoigu in merito, persone che lui stima tantissimo, sappiamo anche dell'amicizia personale che li lega tutti, e quindi ci teneva alla loro opinione definitiva. Il punto è questo, quindi andiamo verso il riconoscimento di Donetsk e Lugansk. Non c'è spazio per ulteriori trattative, è stato detto in maniera chiara ed esplicita, anche da Lavrov. Tutte le strade sono state tentate, ora le vie diplomatiche sono finite. Il riconoscimento proposto dal Partito Comunista Russo, quindi un'iniziativa che parte dall'opposizione al governo attuale russo, è stata approvata dalla Duma e il governo si avvia al suo riconoscimento. Sarà un atto del presidente a riconoscere le due repubbliche. Cosa comporterà questo? Comporterà innanzitutto la reazione dei paesi occidentali, che porranno nuove sanzioni e via dicendo. Loro lo sanno benissimo quello che succederà. La reazione di Kiev, che probabilmente tenterà ancora di attaccare le repubbliche, non lo so, protesterà, ma dovrà abbandonare i territori. Se non lo farà, la Russia attaccherà nuovamente. Potrebbe attaccare anche nel caso in cui continui il lancio di granate e di proiettili d'artiglieria contro la popolazione civile. È chiaro che la Russia preferisce attaccare in risposta a un attacco piuttosto che attaccare. Nella sua storia, mi spiace per i denigratori, ma non l'ha mai fatto. Almeno non mi risulta che l'abbia mai fatto. C'era però forse il caso con la Finlandia, lì bisogna sindacare anche l'invasione forse delle repubbliche baltiche, però c'era il problema di non poco conto della guerra incombente o in atto con la Germania nazista, e pertanto la situazione storica va vista nel suo complesso. Diciamo che dalla seconda guerra mondiale in avanti non abbiamo più registrato di questi casi. Anche l'Afghanistan, l'intervento militare russo sovietico in Afghanistan avvenne su richiesta diretta dell'allora governo afghano per fermare quelli che divennero poi Al-Qaeda, ISIS, talebani e via dicendo, cioè i nuclei iniziali dei mujahideen. Quindi andiamo a vedere che cosa succederà. Le carte sono scoperte e ora le parole passano ai fatti, e quindi vedremo. Grazie per l'attenzione e buona serata.